And for the rest of us who are staying in here, if you have your Bibles with you, you are going to want to turn to Leviticus chapter 18. As we move into this new section of the book of Leviticus, it's worth going back briefly to remember the words that started the Israelites' long stay at Mount Sinai. These are the words that God spoke when they arrived. Now, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is God's intention, that Israel would be God's priests to the world, mediators between God and the nations. That through Israel, the world might know how distinct God is from all false gods. To be effective priests, God expects these people then to spend time with Him, to draw near to Him, so that there, in God's presence, they could see and they could learn God's character, and they could turn around and they could imitate it. So that then as they lived in the world, at the center of the nations, the Israelites would show off God's distinctiveness to the nations. A kingdom of priests, a holy nation. But as we've seen over the last several weeks, God's intentions aren't going to be fulfilled quite so easily, right? Israel seems determined to resist God's voice at every turn. They repeatedly betray God's covenant, and yet God has seemed determined to use these stubborn, stiff-necked people. Now, you may have noticed a pattern develop in what we've been hearing over the last several weeks. At each point in the story where the people expressly disregard or blatantly disobey God, He adds to the law. When they refuse God's invitation to meet with Him on the mountain, God gives them the book of the covenant, the priesthood, and the tabernacle. When Israel worships the golden calf at the foot of the mountain, God gives them intensely specific instructions regarding their worship. When Nadab and Abihu bring an unauthorized fire into the sanctuary, God gives the Israelites precise dietary restrictions and categories determining who can and cannot enter the sanctuary. In the New Testament, Paul describes it this way in his letter to the churches in Galatia. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, he says. And Paul would later write to Timothy, now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and the profane. This is our reality. Right? Think about it like this. Many of you probably would drive safely without a speed limit. But there is a speed limit, because there are also many who would consistently drive without regard for others. Or in a capitalistic economy, there are some who would limit their own financial gain for the sake of others. But as our own history continues to prove, an unregulated system results in some taking advantage of others. We live in a society that writes laws because we need them. Because there are people who consistently act with disregard or even with an intent to harm others. This is the early story of Israel. They needed a law if they were going to survive, if there was any possibility that they were going to be used by God. God had chosen them for a particular purpose, a purpose that they consistently resisted. And so we wonder, as we get caught in the story of Torah, how is it that this God is going to take these people and make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation? Perhaps a law could do for them what their desire refused to do. Maybe if the boundaries were clear and the expectations were spelled out with rewards and consequences, perhaps Israel could be used by God like a disgruntled employee whose heart just isn't really in the work, but he sticks around, toes the company line, and works hard because he knows a bonus check is coming. Maybe, would this be sufficient? If this seems like a really unspiritual approach to transforming people, consider the alternative. God could corrupt their wills and make them want him. I don't think we're any more comfortable with that option. As we arrive then at our passage this morning, chapter 18, Leviticus, we've read in chapter 17 that even with two distinct set of laws given after two distinct set of rebellions, Israel is still avoiding God. And they're still struggling to make sense of even the simplest of distinctions. And so in this way, in keeping with God's pattern, more law is required. More restrictions are needed to help them know exactly what they are to do. Specifics are demanded, and specifics we get as we jump into these chapters. Chapters 18 through 20 of Leviticus are a unit. Though the chapters that follow 20 also deal with holiness, their instructions specifically for the priests. And so chapters 18 through 20 are instructions, are words for all of the people of Israel. Before we read some of the specifics, let me say something about how biblical law works. Because God is not the parent who says, "Because I say so." Whether we find the Bible's or God's reasoning acceptable or not is another issue, but God certainly offers some rationale for why his people ought to follow his instructions. And so let's listen to that rationale as we start reading in Leviticus 18, verse 1. And listen for God's reasoning. He says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord.'" So our introduction here gives us a fairly logical argument. Remember Egypt, the place where you have come from? Egypt had an order to it. And Canaan, the place where you're about to go, also has an order to it. In each of these places, there are accepted, normative, and even legislated ways of living. But God urges that instead of living according to the Egyptian ways or the Canaanite ways, that the people should instead accept his order of things. And so in this way, the people are not choosing between God's restrictive law and some sort of anarchic freedom whereby they do whatever they want, But the case is being made that living as a part of a society, wherever you live, whether it's in Egypt or Canaan or anywhere else, there will always be structure. There will always be some sort of order. And so it's up to them what kind of order they will receive. Will they trust that God's order is a better way to order their lives, and that it is indeed life-giving? So these are the opening words of the section, the opening rationale. And so let's take a look at the closing words. So if you'll flip to, just forward a couple pages to Leviticus 20, and we'll start reading at verse 22. You shall therefore keep my statutes and all my rules and do them, that the land where I'm bringing you to live may not vomit you out. And you shall not walk in the customs of the nation that I am driving out before you. For they did all these things, and therefore I detested them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit the land, their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore separate the clean beast from the unclean, and the unclean bird from the clean. You shall not make yourselves detestable by beast or by bird or by anything with which the ground crawls, which I have set apart for you to hold unclean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine. If the opening paragraph of Leviticus 18 laid out the options. And what were those options? Egypt, Canaan, or the Lord. Here in this concluding paragraph that rounds out this section, the choices are defined. The book of Exodus has already demonstrated that Egypt's not really an option. Egypt's gods have already been proven powerless, and that all Egypt represents is nothing compared to the Lord. And so here, God sets his sights on the Canaanites. Their customs are directly related to all of the instructions we are going to find in these two chapters. They're related to these instructions that God is giving to the Israelites, in that the Israelites are to look distinct from the Canaanites in almost every way. In this way, there are many laws that gain at least some sort of rationale right here. So as you're reading through, if a law doesn't seem to make sense, it likely has something to do, at least at a basic level, with contrasting Canaanite customs. You might say this is God making Israel look different just for the sake of being different. And the reason for this, the Lord describes the Canaanites this way. Their overall customs, he describes in pretty graphic and negative terms. He compares the land of Canaan to a human body that has physiological safeguards against disease. Just as the body will vomit up foreign and diseased objects, so too are the Canaanites' customs, so detestable that the land will preserve itself by vomiting its inhabitants out from it. It's a fairly visual image. It shouldn't be too hard for us, though, to imagine human customs and activity plaguing the earth in such a way. We think of places in China, or on some days, LA, where human ambition has polluted the air, making it literally unbreathable. We know of places in India, places in Africa, and places in the American Northeast where rivers have become undrinkable as a result of human ambition and waste and pollution. Today, in places like Israel and Iraq and Ukraine, the landscape is being permanently altered by bombs, where bodies are strewn and the ground cries out at the blood being spilled. And we are too familiar with the stories of young children whose humanity is stolen from them as they are sold into slavery, abused through oppressive labor, and used for sexual fulfillment. We can imagine what's being described. In a different time, in a different place, human customs were polluting the land. That land had reached its limit and was preparing to vomit the people out to make room for what God intended to be a holy nation. And a holy nation filled with, made up of new inhabitants of this land who were going to be holy in their worship, in their government, their character, and their social order, who in all of these ways were to be so thoroughly distinct from anything that had been seen prior. These new inhabitants, the Israelites, had been set apart so that they might reveal God's utter distinctiveness among the gods of the nations. The nations would be drawn to Israel's God through Israel's holiness. This was the plan. This is some of the foundation, purpose, and rationale for the law. And so let's take a look at some of these laws that were supposed to make Israel distinct from Egypt and from Canaan and from her neighbors. And we'll do this by looking specifically at chapter 19, which in many respects is considered the very heart of the book of Leviticus. And here, let me give you an overview of what we find in this chapter. If you look at verse 2, you'll hear the Lord say, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." In this chapter, we hear at least 7 of the 10 commandments restated in some form. We get some instructions on worship. We find instructions on caring for the poor, for taking care of a stranger who travels to your land, for economic dealings. There are instructions on how one ought to speak, for how you might treat someone with a disability, for navigating an economic class structure, for neighborly relations, for foreign relations, for how to prepare the land for use, for how to trust God with your future. There are instructions for what they're to eat, for how they might cut their hair, for how to keep their body free from certain identifying marks. Can we agree that these instructions are ridiculously broad in what they cover in their overall way of life? It's tempting to see the specifics of these instructions as so antiquated and unrelated to our own world and lives that we shouldn't even deal with them. But there are a couple details related to this chapter that force us to keep this chapter at the center of our study and our focus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Who can tell me where that's from? Ready, go. I heard some answer. Over here. Ready, go. It is in Leviticus 19. What are some other ideas? Who have we heard say this? Jesus, right? So the Gospels give us this as well. This is something Jesus said and went out of his way to emphasize was pretty significant. And we find it here in Leviticus 19. Jesus doesn't just pluck this verse out and say, boom, this verse by itself is more important than the rest. He says that the entirety of the law is captured by this summary command, along with the first command to love the Lord your God with your whole self. This is what the law intends to point his people toward. And so if we are to do as Jesus insists, love our neighbors as ourselves, it's helpful for us to see what it looks like for people in different times and at different places to apply these words to different contexts. So for the Israelites in the wilderness, refusing to discern these things on their own, God tells them exactly how to love their neighbors as themselves. Need the right pronoun there. So some of those, as we look down this list, refusing to steal from your neighbors is a decent start in loving your neighbor as yourself. You also should avoid cheating them in various ways. If they lied to their neighbors, that also wasn't love. Neither is refusing to pay their workers on the day of their work, making them suffer unnecessarily by delaying their pay. We could see how that would be unloving. It's also not loving your neighbor to mock or take advantage of your neighbor if they cannot see or hear. And judging neighbors in a court, first and foremost, is about justice. Justice is a way of loving. And so, no advantage should be given to anyone because of their economic status. Don't pity the poor and don't honor the wealthy. In the court, everyone is equal. Loving neighbors means don't slander them, right? I mean, some of these are maybe overly obvious, but loving neighbors also meant correcting them. In a community that had corporately confessed their allegiance to God, they had bound themselves to the same set of laws, and to love your neighbor was to correct them. It was also to forgive them. Loving neighbors meant honoring your elders and loving as a native, the foreigner who traveled in your land. And so here you can see, right, how God is developing this summary command, love your neighbor as yourself, by actively applying neighbor to a wide range of real situations and real relationships that the Israelites are going to face. And when we later get to the prophets in the First Testament, this is what they're busy doing. They identify the ways that the people have failed to love God and to love their neighbors, and they describe for them, they paint pictures for them about what faithful love to God and to your neighbors might look like. The prophets call the people to return to God's voice and to return to his covenant. And when we get to the Gospels, we see Jesus continue this very same tradition. This is what he's doing. But we see him push past the letter of the law to make abundantly clear that observing the letter is insufficient, right? Because it's not enough to say, obviously, I love my neighbor. I haven't murdered him. But Jesus, right, pushes us to consider that if we're actually going to love our neighbor, we have to work to not even be angry with this person in our heart. And so we think about the way that Jesus, having studied and meditated on and internalized Leviticus, understood the intention behind God's law. And he was able to capture its spirit as he reapplied it for a new day. And part of reapplying a law is understanding how it was meant to be used in the first place. Leviticus 19 provided Jesus primary source material for God's intentions. So much so, and he seemed to have used it so often, that Jesus' disciples, along with Paul, drew constantly from Leviticus 19 at several key points. Peter, in 1 Peter, exhorts the church, you are to be holy in your conduct, as he who called you is holy. Sounds familiar, right? It's from this first chapter. He actually then quotes Leviticus 19:2 as his authority. You shall be holy, for I am holy. James in his letter will later adapt most of the instructions. If you look here at chapter 19, verses 12 to 19, most of this material gets readapted in James's letter. The book of Hebrews, chapters 12 and 13, are concerned with acceptable worship. Worship defined by loving God and loving neighbors. And then when the disciples write to Paul, they urge him to care for the poor, and Paul confirms that this is exactly what he's been eager to do, also having been shaped by God's heart expressed in Leviticus. At one time and in one place, Leviticus gave very clear, explicit instructions on how the Israelites were to order their lives, so that if they observed them, they would reveal God's distinctiveness to the nations. At every place and time since then, God's people, including the prophets, Jesus, Paul, and the rest of the apostles, have been seeking God in Leviticus to discern his intentions, to understand God's holiness, so that they can turn and live out God's purposes as faithfully as possible, which sometimes means not living out the letter, but attempting to live out the spirit of the law. The church without Leviticus 19, is impoverished. Not because we are required to follow it slavishly, but because in it we hear God's heartbeat for the marginalized, for the disadvantaged, for the foreigner, for the oppressed, for the cheated, for the hated, and on and on. Leviticus 19 trains us to see how God instructed a stubborn people to love these kinds of people, so that we can then turn to Jesus and see how he expects us, those who declare that we desire to love God and love our neighbors, how we might love these kinds of people. This is why Jesus often pushes the line further for us. If God was instructing a hard-hearted people in Leviticus 19, then we, who are having our hearts and minds transformed, ought to do much more, right? Not because he's commanded it, but because we have sought God, because we have learned his desires, and because we have begun to desire what he desires. I wish I could say I knew exactly how Leviticus 19 ought to be lived out in the church today. But, I mean, if we're honest, to some degree, it takes all of us. It takes a community seeking and reading and understanding and attempting to develop our own conclusions about the way that we might embody this. But in light of Leviticus 19 and what we've read this week, there are some things that probably could come to mind that we could think about. The church should be concerned about some of the ways that we sometimes seem to ignore Jesus' command to love God with our whole selves and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so I want to offer a couple thoughts, and maybe one of them strikes you and you take it this week and you wrestle with it, have a conversation about it, flesh out some of the implications of it. I think the church ought to be concerned with the growing gap between the rich and the poor, not just in America, but throughout the world. And that the church doesn't really seem to be concerned with this issue is an issue. We should be concerned that in matters of justice, the poor are charged with crimes, convicted, and spend real time in jail, exponentially more than the rich. Drug use in America happens at fairly equal rates among the rich, the middle class, and the poor, and yet the poor are incarcerated at much higher rates. Many of the arguments about our border policy change altogether in the face of love the foreigner who travels in your land as you treat the native among you. How eagerly do we gobble up the lies and slander that cover the magazines and tabloids across the racks in our grocery stores or on our Twitter feeds. Christians, fearful of the future, looking for some degree of control over their lives, are consistently and constantly turning to various forms of fortune telling, whether it be something as seemingly insignificant as horoscopes or strange ideas about what God might have to say about the future. What if loving our neighbors as ourselves involves creating space in our lives to think about the needs of others at least as much as we give to thinking about ourselves? What if we did an evaluation of the amount of time that we spend thinking about ourselves and our own needs and our own lives? And what would it look like to devote an equal amount of that time to the needs of our neighbors, to those around us? Many of you have heard me say this before, but I think what we do on Sunday mornings in our community breakfast is probably one of the single best embodiments of Leviticus 19. This call to care for others, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Like I said, these are just a few kind of thought-provoking possibilities about where Leviticus 19 might take us. Leviticus continues, if you'll hear it, to extend us an invitation. It invites us to draw near to God as He has drawn near to us. It invites us to seek Him, to know Him, and to be transformed by Him, to be holy as He is holy. First Peter goes on to tell us in his letter, 1 Peter, we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that we may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called us out of darkness and into His marvelous light. This is good news. And as we continue our worship this morning by coming to the table and receiving the bread and the cup, we're reminded that this call to love our neighbors as ourselves is a call to embody the very love of God. And as we come to the table and we receive the bread and the cup, we are reminded of the kind of love that God has demonstrated for us. It's the kind of love whereby God would offer Himself for His enemies so that we might have life even though we were completely undeserving. And so as you come and you receive this morning, would you receive that invitation to know this God, to walk with Him, and then to be part of this kingdom of priests, this holy nation that in a very different way than Israel, but yet still very real, are to go into the world and demonstrate God's utter distinctiveness.